Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about the intellectual virtues or the art of thinking well. Let us begin. So first, some general observations about the intellectual virtues. Intellectual virtues are the qualities or dispositions or habits of good thinkers and good learners. You can think that of the definition of what it is to be a virtue, intellectual virtue. Put differently, they are the qualities or habits acquired by those people who earnestly want to know the truth. There are some people who seek to know the truth, and they're seeking to do so. They engage in different kinds of activities. They do different things. They develop different habits. And the habits that are conducive to attaining the truth, the kinds of things you can do that will make it more likely that you will know reality as it is, that you attain truth, those are defined as the intellectual virtues. The kinds of qualities or habits that you can, things you can do, you can acquire, that get in the way of attaining truth, those are defined as the vices. So there's nothing mysterious about virtue or vice here. Virtue is the thing that enables you to succeed in the task of attaining truth when you earnestly want to attain it. They're the kinds of habits you can develop so that you can attain truth. In vice is the thing that gets in the way. Vice are the habits or qualities that you can engage in or do that would prevent you from attaining truth, that will get in the way for you to understand and know things. So importantly, the intellectual virtues are different from, though related to, physiological facts like raw IQ, memory capacity, computational capacity, and similar kinds of intellectual capacities or talents. The virtues are not quite those things. Virtues are more like habits, things you develop with time. They're like skills that you can develop and acquire through time. The virtues are also different from, though related to, the moral virtues. So intellectual virtues are about thinking well. Moral virtues are about being a good person, having a good moral character, about being kind, being benevolent, and so on. Those are moral. And intellectual, they're kind of related. People tend to have them both or tend to like them both, but they're different. Intellectual virtues are just about the mind, just about thinking well and attaining truth and retaining truth and learning and so on. So they're intellectual, purely intellectual. Intellectual virtues and vices are habits and dispositions. They're not a single act. Just like one cannot justifiably claim to be courageous because they made one courageous act, to be courageous is to be a kind of person, is to develop a kind of personality, is to kind of build your destiny in a particular way, is to define who you are through time, throughout your life. The virtues are like that. They're define the kind of personality that you have, the kind of person that you are through time, something stable through your life, your personality, your character at the intellectual level. They're something that is not defined at the one occasion, that you do something right one time or wrong one time does not yet develop into a virtue. It's not yet a virtue. By contrast, intellectual characters, are formed gradually by small decisions that form patterns of behavior that shape who you are in the long run. Here's a cool quote from the book. A person's character is forged not in one dramatic moment, but in the ledger of his or her daily work. It is the kind of personality you build one step at a time, one choice at a time. It takes slow, continuous work to build the kind of thing that you do, the kind of thing that you are, intellectually speaking. And that makes sense if you compare it with a skill. So think about playing the piano, playing the guitar, mastering something like taekwondo or boxing, soccer, basketball, any of those kind of skills or talents that require a lot of dedication, a lot of work, a lot of training, a lot of practice. The intellectual virtues are something very similar to that. One can only develop them in the same way that you develop these other skills, by dedicating a lot of time, by putting effort into it, by keep practicing, keep looking at the masters, looking at those that know, and imitating what they have to do. If you want to know how to paint well, if you want to be a great painter, here's a good strategy. Go to those that paint, go to the great painters, and see what they do and start imitating. And of course, the first time you're going to try, even if you're naturally talented, you're going to be a lot worse, right? It takes this active, conscious commitment, this dedication to being a good painter. And then you spend hours and hours and hours trying to master the different kind of technique. It is a lifelong journey. It is a commitment to being the kind of person, to being a painter, a good painter. And the more time you dedicate into it, the more expertise you develop, the more techniques you develop, you master, and so on, and the better of a painter you are. And intellectual virtues are just like that. There are things that you can develop and things you can grow into by one choice at a time, one decision at a time. You look at the people that are good at thinking, you look at the people that are good at learning, that can attain a lot of truth, and you see what they do, you imitate what they do, much like painting. So here's to sum it up, we defined and build ourselves gradually and slowly, one choice at a time. And that happens in a daily life, that happens in our, these kinds of skills, artistic skills, and it happens in the intellectual mind as well. So let's look, so those are the general observations. Let's look at let's begin with one particular intellectual virtue, and this is intellectual courage. And one of the limitations of the text is that the author does not give you a very careful definition of the virtues. So I provided one of those for you. The author does a great job of describing people that have those virtues and describing a lot of their characteristics, but it lacks a definition. So here are some definitions. So I define intellectual courage in the following way: a disposition to persist in thinking, inquiring, discussing, in similar kinds of intellectual activities, despite the presence of some threat or fear, including fear of failure or fear of embarrassment. And the slogan, to give you a kind of remind you of the idea, is take risks. And here's a picture of a lion. This courage, embodies courage. Aristotle famously said and truthfully said that virtues are means between vices, typically two vices, sometimes more. And the thought is that to do something well, it takes kind of precision, it takes caution, it takes paying attention, being careful. There are many ways of going wrong. There are many ways of doing something wrong. And typically not as many ways of doing it correctly. So a lot of these intellectual virtues are means between two ways of getting it wrong, ways of trying to do something similar, but going to one extreme or the other. So it's kind of a mean between two extremes. And here are two extremes that one can fall into if one fails to be intellectually courageous. One is that one can be intellectually timid. Intellectual timidity is a disposition to distrust one's intellectual capacities and simply follow or accept what others say. You're in the context of a classroom, the professor's talking about something interesting, you're starting to form your own opinion about it, you start to engage with the content, you try to build a conception or interpretation of what's happening, and you realize that most of your peers start disagreeing with your interpretation. They start thinking something different. And a temptation, intellectual timidity temptation, is to ignore, to distrust your own intellectual capacities, to simply go with the flow, because others think differently, you just follow what they say. And if you tend to do that, if you develop that habit, you develop the vice of intellectual timidity. Why is it a vice? Because it prohibits or limits your ability to know the truth. If you're susceptible to, if you have a disposition towards simply accepting what the dominant group happens to believe, you would not know the truth unless you by luck happen to stumble upon a group that believes true things. But that's kind of not the right way of knowing truth, right? You should know the truth via responding to evidence, not by happenstance being placed in a community that knows it. In general, it's a bad strategy to attain truth to simply follow what the group says. Groups as a whole, they have no guarantee of attaining truth. Right? It's responding to the evidence appropriately that it maximizes your chances of attaining the truth. So if you're intellectually timid, if you just follow the crowd, you'll likely not know the truth. You just fit in, but not know. So that's one extreme that you can fall into. The other extreme is something like intellectual stubbornness. And the intellectually timid person too willingly, too easily follows what other people think because they distrust their own capacities, their own intellectual capacities. The intellectually stubborn person, on the other hand, they're too arrogant. They think too highly of themselves. They adhere to, or they have a disposition to adhere to their beliefs without regard to contrary evidence. The group starts pointing not just different opinions, but reasons for thinking that the intellectually stubborn person is mistaken. And what makes them intellectually stubborn is that they just disregard the contrary evidence. They believe what they believe, and they're not going to listen to you. They're not going to listen to your evidence that is undermining or creating some tension with what they say, what they believe. That's, of course, also a intellectual vice. And again, intellectual vice, because it gets in the way, it prevents you from attaining truth. If you're intellectually stubborn and you just defend what you believe because that's what you believe without looking at the evidence, chances are you will not know the truth. Chances are you'll just grow up believing something and die believing that something, and without any actual learning or growth in the intellectual realm. So to be stubborn is to close yourself towards growth and development in the intellectual realm and towards truth, right? You fail to know more things. So those are two ways, two extremes, two vices that one can fall into, two temptations one can succumb to when we're trying to be intellectually courageous. And you can see how they're kind of extreme versions of what the intellectually courageous person does well. Here's a cool quote from the book. Those who are intellectually courageous earnestly want to know the truth, and so they take risks in the pursuit and promotion of truth. They are willing to reconsider their own beliefs, even if it scares them, right? That's part of being courageous, that you're willing to confront the possibility of you being mistaken, even if that's a threatening prospect. So the author himself says that he's a faithful believer. He's a Christian. He sees the world. He makes sense of the world through his Christian eyes. Things in reality make sense because they're created by God. People have dignity because they're made in the image and likeness of God, and so on. He ought to do what he ought to do. His moral conception is filtered through God and Christianity, the Bible, and so on. So his very understanding or interpretation of reality presupposes this belief in God. And he says very clearly, the thought that I can be mistaken about that, about Christianity, about God, is a frightening, it's a very scary prospect. Why? Because his whole comprehension of himself, the story he tells himself about who he is, about what reality is like, it would all fall apart. And now that's a point that demands intellectual courage, or being intellectually coward. Intellectual courage is when one is willing to confront those fearful, those threatening prospects. They can be mistaken for something as significant as whether or not God exists. And he realizes intellectual courage demands that one looks at those beliefs and asks sincerely, are they true? Even though it's frightening that they might not be. So intellectual courage demands that we pursue the truth, that we investigate the truth, even in the presence of fear, of failure, or embarrassment, or in this case, something much more serious. Here are a couple of examples that help illustrate what intellectual courage, and of course, that person jumping over those rocks is a great example of courage in general. But Galileo is a good example of an intellectually courageous person. On several occasions, Galileo defended the then controversial Copernican view that the Earth is not the center of the universe in the face of powerful and threatening authorities, i.e. the Inquisition. Despite these grave threats and the scorn of many of his fellow scientists, he was a minority defender of minority view, Galileo stood up for what he was considering to be the truth, not blindly, right, but on the basis of the evidence that he had. So he thought he knew the truth, and he was courageously fighting for it. That's an example of intellectual courage. That's a grand example. Here's a much more relatable example. The young student deciding whether to raise her hand in class. If she does raise her hand, she is risking the mockery of her peers, who will either see that she does not understand the material or tease her for being overly enthusiastic. Unfortunately, some people do that. Yet, without this small act of courage, her growth is stunted. She begins to fall farther and farther behind, and a self-fulfilling cycle of fear and ignorance is initiated. The more behind she is, the less she understands, the less willing she is to raise her hands, because the more ignorance is going to be portrayed, revealed by her questions and so on. So this cycle gets initiated. In contrast that, with the confidence she gains as she grasps the content and can use that knowledge as a base to understanding more advanced concepts as they are introduced later. In other words, think of the possible different life plans or trajectories of someone who, in the moment of choice, when courage, intellectual courage is called for, they do it. They do the courageous thing, or they fail to do so. They're timid, or they're coward, intellectually coward, or something, or intellectually stubborn. They just say no. Those that go for the vices tend not to do as well, tend to not develop the habits of thinking well and acquiring knowledge, but rather they're kind of stuck in this cycle of ignorance, or at least tend to move in that direction. Whereas someone who is courageous and willing to ask the question, willing to face the potential fear of embarrassment, that person is more likely to do well. That person is more likely to succeed and attain the truth and develop and grow in her future classes, right? So you can see clearly how the habit of being intellectually courageous is the kind of thing that leads someone to attain more truth, develop intellectually. So final observations about intellectual courage. Courageous thinking habits are at the heart and growth of progress. In other words, your character is something you build one choice at a time. And sometimes the choices are going to be relatively straightforward. They're going to be, take another half an hour to study for your exam. But sometimes they might demand that you confront or face fear or the possibility of a minor threat. So in those cases, it is intellectual courage that is called for. Growth presupposes struggle, and it takes courage to undergo through the struggle and grow. So intellectual courage is at the heart of the virtuous life. Intellectual courage is an important condition for the other virtues. It seems to be prior in some sense to the other virtues. Why? Because one cannot be intellectually honest, say, or intellectually fair-minded, or if you're afraid. It's hard to be intellectually honest if you're afraid. It's hard to, if we're going to look at the other virtues later, but it's hard to be any of the virtues, develop any of the other virtues if you're going to be afraid. And fear is the opposite of courage. So courage seems to be a condition for the development of any and all of the other intellectual virtues. Because of this, the permanent mark of the intellectually vicious is intellectual fear. If you're intellectually vicious, you don't know much, you're stuck in your ignorance, you tend to be afraid of new ideas. You tend to be afraid of things that are complex, afraid of things that are unknown or other or different than the familiar. That seems to be the permanent mark of he who's stuck in ignorance. How do you escape that cycle of ignorance? By being courageous. So on the other hand, the permanent mark of the intellectually virtuous person is intellectual courage. Willingness to confront the unknown, willingness to engage with the complex, willingness to look at different ideas, willingness to question or at least reflect upon the ideas you've been brought up with, though which is familiar. Willingness to question whether or not they're true and try to figure that out. It takes courage to do that. Okay, let's end here. That's intellectual courage. We'll see you next time.